Um, I'm just going to say a few things about studio writing to give everybody a context of where we are beyond Zoom or the context that we're in. So I'm Timmy Simonds. I'm one of the group of artists, critics, performers, and poets that teach in a program called Studio Writing at Pratt. Um, Here at Pratt, studio writing is the sequence of 3 classes that fine art students take at the end of their BFA to introduce the uses of writing as an essential and also a versatile creative tool for studio art practice. It is also one of many other interdisciplinary programs like architecture writing, that's been around for a long time, writing for interior design, and thesis writing that stitch themselves across Pratt's campus, thanks to a larger kind of umbrella program called Writing Across the Curriculum and our host department itself, Humanities and Media Studies. It is also, studio writing is also a core family of faculty. It's nice to hear from Cameron to get that shout out about building this together, because the sort of family of faculty were sort of collectively dedicated to thinking about the role of writing in visual leaning creative practices. And many of us designed and built the program together. So that's at Pratt, but beyond Pratt and sort of within Pratt also, I kind of want to mention how I think we collectively think about studio writing and how I've been thinking about it. Studio writing is all the unique relationships that artists have found and continue to find to work with writing as a medium. It's not limited to conceptual art. It's not limited to scripts, scores, and syllabi. It's not limited to artist talks. It's not limited to press releases. I like to think about it as all the ventriloquisms. Studio writing is writing in, through, around, alongside, despite, beyond, and because of art. Recently, I've also been thinking about writing in a way as a bit of a break from the sort of icon, effigy, reliquary way of heritage of worshiping objects. So welcome all. I'm very excited to see how this conversation develops. I want to thank our studio writing team, that family I mentioned. I hopefully I'm not forgetting, I know I'm forgetting some that have taught in the past, but hopefully not too many. Bethany Ides, Catherine Cullen Dupont, Jean-Paul Perquier, Sasha Frey, Saul Anton, Yumna Shala, Melissa Eidson, Diane Cohen-Fisher, Mara Conley, Leila Zami, Maria Damon, Eli Moss, Dominica Page Giglio, and all of the many other people that have taught one semester or more in the program. Of course, also Cameron, who's here with us and will be picking up from me again in a second. And I just want to, of course, thank Pratt and Gina Marchetti and Joshua Tan from the Humanities and Media Studies for continuing to support this after the first year that was initiated, was the initiation of this series. And of course, Suzanne Verderber, who was the first person to help with funding it. All right, I'll pass it back to Cameron. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully people are also popping in as we go along. And yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much, Timmy. It's my honor to welcome our guests here today for this conversation that I'm very excited to witness. So today we have Dena Yago and David Yu in conversation with Christine Negus. And so I will introduce them each briefly. Dena lives and works in New York City and is an artist, writer, and founding member of the trend forecasting group K-Hole. Recent exhibitions include the upcoming show Capacity at JTT here in New York City, which opens on May 15th. And Barbe et Papa at the CAPC Museum of Contemporary Art in Bordeaux in 2022, Industry City at High Art in Paris in 2022, Force Majeure at High Art in Paris in 2019, and Made in LA at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles in 2016. Dena's recent publications include Fade the Lure, published by After 8 Books in 2019, and her writing has appeared in eFlux Journal, Flash Art, and Frieze Magazine. In addition to her visual practice, she works as a cultural strategist with the artist-based consultancy Applied Arts. And the URLs for her upcoming exhibition at JTT and her personal website will be in the chat shortly. Next, we have David Yu. David is a Toronto-based artist working in multimedia, installation, and performance. His work includes sculptural forms and installation, as well as audio, video, and live performers. David's practice modifies and pinpoints areas where sculpture, installation, performance, and audience intersect by exposing the notion of the performative gesture. David has a master's in fine arts from the Slade School of Fine Art in London, UK, and received a BFA from the Ontario College of Art and Design. Recent exhibitions and projects include a citywide art installation commissioned and curated by the Duncan and Jordan Stone College of Art and Design, funded by the Scottish Art Council in Dundee, Scotland, a Triangle Arts Trust residency and solo exhibition at the Kiwana Trust Gallery in Nairobi, Kenya, participation with Flux Night 2012 in Atlanta, Georgia, Mart Gallery, Dublin, Ireland in 2015, Locust Projects, Miami, Florida in 2018, YYZ Artist Outlet, Toronto, Canada 2018, Orleans Gallery, Ottawa, Canada 2018, Mayworks Festival, Toronto, Canada, and Nicholas Robert Gallery, Toronto, Canada 2020, and X in Waiting, the app with London, Ontario Media Arts Association in 2023. Currently, David is also working on performance-based research, which investigates the role of the viewer as performer within installation practices and has been generously funded by the Canada Council for the Arts. And then our moderator conversationalist joining us this afternoon is Christine Negus. Christine is an interdisciplinary artist, scholar, and recipient of the National Film Board of Canada's Best Emerging Canadian Video Filmmaker Award. Negus's work examines the potential of feminist, queer, and disability praxis through dis/embodied modes of resistance, moving between installation and media projects, community programming, grassroots pedagogy, and critical writing. Their practice embodies the generative possibilities of disobedience performed through minoritarian action. Christine's recent exhibitions and screenings include Crossroads, Queer City Cinema, Mix NYC, Tangled Art Gallery, Artist Television Access, Dunlop Gallery, AKA Artist Run, Milwaukee Underground Film Festival, Media City Film Festival, Swedish Film Institute, Art Gallery of York University, Montreal Underground Film Festival, and Kassler Doc Fest. As well, they have had solo exhibitions and screenings at RPL Film Theater, Forest City Gallery, TPW, Gallery West, Julius Caesar, The Pitch Project, Modern Fuel, and YYZ Artist Outlet. Christine's creative and critical writing have been published in The Rusty Taupe, Blast Counterblast, Casual Encounters Catalyst, Cindy Baker, Seeds, Alexandra Gellis, Black Flash Magazine, and Christine is currently co-editing a forthcoming anthology on critical fat phenomenology. And Christine has also curated series such as Mediations, Art and Activism, Broad Topics, A Matrilineage of Media, Queer Frontiers, Queer Futurity and in Canadian Media, and Virtual Encounters, New Entanglements in Performance and Media. I am all the more honored to be joined by people whose bios completely make me run out of breath because of their accomplishments. So to begin the conversation today, Dena will introduce us to a small sample of her work and of her relationship to writing with, as, and for art. And then David will likewise introduce us to a small sample of his work and how he uses writing in his practice. And then Christine will briefly introduce how they are thinking of David and Dena's very distinct practices together at this moment in time, and how we might begin to think about our own relations to art and writing and language in this particular time and place. So first, Dena.
All right, let me try to share my screen. Are you guys seeing this full screen?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so thank you all for having me. When given the prompt of speaking about writing's relationship with and all of the prepositions to my work, I decided to take a pretty temporally linear approach and start with right when I was finishing undergrad here in New York around 2010. My background was in photography, and then I found myself working at a corporate law firm in Zuccotti Park doing tech rollout. So giving all of the lawyers new Blackberries, upgrading their servers, and all of that really banal back-end work. And as I was trying to sort of figure out, without having the resources or the studio or the money to kind of continue like a traditional darkroom photography practice, was sort of trying to figure out what and how I could figure that into the life that I was making for myself. And the tools that I had the tool at hand was really my Blackberry. And I realized that there was so much time that I was spending, so much downtime within this corporate environment. And the thing that I was mainly kind of concerned with was like avoiding human interaction with other people, because I felt very out of place, felt very alienated, and had started kind of turning to the Blackberry as a way to take notes and sort of start sketching out photographs that I would want to start making. But then kind of simultaneously, as I was going office to office, I was faced with this kind of like corporate concrete poetry at everybody's desk. So everybody had these sort of like, it is what it is, Rubik's cubes, or these signs like dedicate yourself with a calm mind to the task at hand, smiley emoji. And that was sort of, I was being kind of like reflected with this new poetic that I hadn't experienced when I was in undergrad at Columbia dealing with theoretical art texts. And realized that sort of the text that was coming out of me at that time was something different. It wasn't, just language, a sketchbook. It could be this other form. It could become a sort of concrete poetry in its own right. So I started this sort of ongoing running epic poem called Standard Remote, which was one of the network settings for this tech rollout, and had created a blog spot at that time where it would just sort of like upload the poetry. I could email it to an email address and it would sort of post it as this running poem. So that was kind of my first foray into writing at that time. It was really the material at hand, it was economical, and it felt like this sort of excess of experience within an alienated condition, and felt therapeutic. It felt very and also avoidant, but it was sort of a way of me processing that experience. That sort of grew into a visual practice where, not having as much access to photo studio situations, I started using a desktop scanner because, again, it was cheap and it was at home, and kind of like using that as a sketchbook, using the poetry as a sketchbook, and had this second running poem / practice called Esprit, similarly kind of using fragments that were taken from a writing practice that was very much outside of the home, and balancing that out with a visual kind of more daily experimentation using the scanner as the medium. Simultaneously at the same time, I started working with this group of 4 friends when I was still in undergrad, to establish a trend forecasting group called K-Hole. And that was a very writing-based practice as well. So on the one hand, I was doing this sort of like daily exploration through, corporate poetics. On the other hand, I was sort of looking at this corporatized form, a trend forecasting report. It's a now I think more commonly known, but they're just these PDFs that go for tens of thousands of dollars that have very kind of, marketing-based cultural criticism, and we had decided that it would be a good form to kind of detour and mount our own cultural critique. So the writing that took place within that realm was really about like naming the structures of feeling and the sort of threads that we were witnessing as right out of college, people partying and going out in downtown New York. We put out these free reports. We had a very kind of collaborative sort of friction as the medium way of writing together, where we'd established this externalized voice. So I kind of think about this as another mode for writing within a visual sphere, where you're collectively constructing this sort of third body that everyone can inhabit at will and kind of write through. And that has carried on through a lot of my other writing, where the sort of power of the collective allowed me to make more declarative statements that I think I felt like I had license to as an individual. And these documents, which are all still free for download and available at khole.net, are visual essays in a way. There's the copy, and then there's the kind of memes. And the biggest meme that came out of this collective practice was normcore. So we had launched this report almost 10 years ago now, where we were kind of identifying one vibe, I guess you could say, that we were observing at the time that struck a chord and sort of went viral, I guess, in a way. But a lot of the language-based tools that we were using to sort of navigate what our positions were things like, Graham's squares, semiotic squares, using these sort of diagrammatic structures to construct a position that we had at the time. So those are kind of like two dominant things. But then I was also really trying to sort of figure out this thread of my visual practice, K-hole being very visually driven. The poetry was taking book form and having this relationship with the scans and other works. But I kept trying to sort of like wrestle with how writing and image can coexist with one another in not a purely descriptive, caption-based or illustrative way. And the way that I'd sort of started talking about it at the time was that one would sort of inflect the other, and thought a lot about these things and spatially how they would exist in an exhibition format, or just kind of what other models that felt natural to me to work within where text and image are in dialogue and not just serving the other master, I guess. This is a work that I made in 2021 where it got very, I had worked on another collaborative theater piece with Tala Henkel and Max Pitagoff and Pablo Larios in Berlin as a part of New Theater, where we were collectively writing a play. And I started to kind of think about, okay, well, theater obviously is an arena where this makes sense. You're dealing with the embodied and the visual, and I'm not a performance artist by any means. So I'd written a play during early COVID called Dry Season, which I then performed through these reprogrammed Billy Bass. And I think that another thread in my work is sort of using popular cultural forms and figuring out how to kind of subvert those in different ways, or just use them as the mouthpieces for other hard pills to swallow a bit. Around the same time, I was thinking of other forms where visual and language-based media interact, and kind of had a really dumb aha moment that cartoons and comic books are really the model in a lot of ways, especially when I'm not dealing with time-based media. So I started to kind of think about these threads in my practice where I have long form essays, I have these trend forecasting reports, I have these poems and cultural criticism. How can I kind of think about constructing those in a work where they can be read in a different way, like a more kind of embodied physical way? Everyone's attention is just being capitalized by every other media. I'm jokingly say that I'm a long form girl in a hot take world. And writing these like 8,000 word level essays and realizing that no one's really reading them, there is a level of kind of just a different mode of reading that I'm very interested in. So I started thinking about, I was making these wall paintings and kind of larger scale murals, and was thinking about what is like the physical relationship to the media that we read, especially when we're on our phones all the time. And because so much of my writing kind of comes out of me in spaces other than my own home, like moving around the city, being on the subway, or, you know, working in a law firm or whatever, how can I kind of mirror that or think about what the viewer's relationship to text in that way could be? So I started making these dressing screens that kind of function as architectural dividers. They navigate people through this space. This is a very head-on view, but oftentimes they're sort of askew and become way-making to other works in an exhibition context as well. And then the back of these, which I don't have included here, are these sort of color fields. So what is the space for reading versus the space for digesting or processing or meditating, and letting things sort of register in a slow media form. And I think this is a question that we all have to consider, with like TikTok logic being the dominant one. What does slow media look like? What does it feel like? Where does it exist? And, you know, maybe I'm a bit of a romantic here, but I do think that given all of the issues with the art world, it is still an arena where complexity and the time scale can be experienced differently. And that's, I think, why, you know, sticking it out here. The way that these are made, just on a technical angle, I guess, or they're inkjet printed on canvas, then they are painted on top of that. The process is really just an organic one that came out of how I know and choose to make images. All of the text is done through vinyl stenciling. So there's this kind of rewriting that happens. There's the writing that happens at many different stages. And for me, I think that that's important because it then becomes condensed in a way. I spend quite a lot of time on the language choices, to the point where I feel like it's the most, it's like a balsamic reduction of text here. And I think also because so much of the information that's coming in to my world is through memes and the internet. Spent a lot of time online, and obviously that logic kind of gets reinscribed into the work as well. I think something that I think about a lot in terms of writing is just what is the immediacy of reception versus processing. And that is something that I think that, yeah, what does it mean for like a meme element to become part of a painting? I think you can spend more time with it, I guess. And then just the last thing I'll sort of touch on is that a lot of the work, or a lot of the words that come into my work is, it's a lot of language that kind of is inbound through my work in a more corporate sphere. And I'm extremely sensitive to branding and how parts of human experience and human agency is sort of strip mined and repackaged in a way where certain things that are proposed to us as emancipatory can actually be, you know, the new chains within which we exist. So this piece specifically is called Cursed Virtues. It was part of the show that I did last spring called Industry City, thinking about all of these sort of false promises that came out of maybe 68 era ideology about how artists, you know, a lot of kind of creative characteristics of art making and cultural production were seen as something that were individually motivated and liberatory, but really kind of mask the precarity under which we live. And so these words might seem pretty buzzy, or like they'd show up on a LinkedIn job post or anything like that, but there's always this underside to the many leaves. In this work specifically, there's this larger piece on the left, and then there's, you know, 5 corresponding smaller paintings where there's these poetic definitions of each of the terms that might hold some of the other hues for that. Yep, and then this is kind of my most recent work that I made, which was at CAPC in Bordeaux. Is a double-sided painting, which was based on a 16th century French folktale, which was kind of a labor parable. It's called The Kid, based on it's somewhat similar to the Golden Goose, if you're familiar. But here, yes, it's very much like a one-to-one in terms of this folktale, which was then described in longer form in the wall text, but I don't necessarily think that that's critical to reading of the work, which again is sort of wedged into this site-specific pillar here. Yep, there we go. Nice.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm David Yu. I'm a multimedia installation and performance artist. I guess I'll share my screen so you have something more interesting to look at. So writing in my practice is pretty central. I have used it as a tool to sort of steer my entire practice for the last 8 years. I've created a loose theory that's kind of derived from lots of other theories all mixed together. I call it relational performance. And it's one of these ideas of trying to locate that performative gesture or that moment when an audience member can interact with the work. So I started writing about this 8 years ago to sort of find direction and also to frame what I was trying to do with my practice, because when you see my work, it bleeds into a lot of different areas. It's installation, it's sculpture, there's some media involved in it, there's audio. Oftentimes it's cues of trying to distract the viewer or trying to engage with them in a more visceral way. So with this theory, I was trying to build it up for myself to kind of make my work more real for myself. And so with that, I kind of pulled in ideas of fluxus, so ideas where the audience would finish the work, relational aesthetics, of course, because of its site location and trying to activate real estate, heterotopias, so other sites, and then also object-oriented ontology, which is sort of objects in the expanded field and the experience that you have with an object, and objects can kind of encapsulate a lot of things. So I'm going to go through 4 works that sort of got pulled through from my writing practice. Again, I used this as a tool to sort of find funding through grants, and it was a really great way for me to steer how I was going to examine performative practice. This work here is called Boop, and it's a exhibition intervention installation. It's made up of table legs, which are usually a supportive structure, but kind of turned on its side and created a precarious kind of structure that's also like formally like a sculpture, and installed at the front of a gallery space. This was installed at Mark Galleries in Dublin, Ireland. These stilts were holding up the structure completely, and they people that were coming into the show had to negotiate this sculpture before coming in and seeing the rest of the work. If folks knocked it down, they would have destroyed the work and it would never be set up again. They had to bend down, bow to the space, and then enter to see the rest of the works that were on display. What happened during the opening was people knew that this structure was kind of the main deal, and they ended up standing at the other side of the room and created the front of the gallery space like the stage to watch the performance of this piece, basically. Yeah, this was kind of like the initial sort of exploring this type of creating a theory, trying to work it, trying to make works for the theory almost in a way, and working it out for myself. Like I was always pinpointing areas that I was interested in terms of what does performance mean, and how do you get people to like shake up, wake up, and look at work in a more kind of visceral way, get their bodies involved in it. Obviously, there's some accessibility issues with this, but this was done a long time ago. um, the other work that was a part of that show is this work. It was the TV installed really low to the ground with a very short cable with the audio. It's called This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things. It was propped up precariously again with a little steel pin, and the video or on the screen was reflecting against the side of the wall. The audio that you're hearing is actually audio that I took when I was in Dublin. I was walking through their museums and stealing people's conversations and opinions about the artworks that are on display, and then taking photographs of the artworks. So when people were talking about it, it was reflected in the screen. So it's kind of like an idea of like a gossip mill, one of those sort of behaviors. People had to bend down quite low in order to listen to the gossip. If they were to pull the TV back, the pin would drop and then create a loud ding in the space, because this was like a concrete, so that everyone would that was in the exhibition space would spin around and look at the person that dared looked at the screen of what they were talking about. So this is a kind of an example of just sort of wanting to like engage the audience in a more visceral way, and getting them to like react to the work, listen to it, and like have their curiosity sort of pull it apart. Um, this was The Thirst is Real, and it was done during a performance festival in 2019. It was in Edmonton, Alberta, and there was multiple artists that was part of this performance festival as well. I was performing, but not performing. I was just like basically lying down on the ground and catching the drops from this sculptural glass vessel with water in it. Beside me was a battery pack with my phone number on it, and people can engage with me in a heterotopic space through my phone via text and ask me anything. I didn't have a prepared script for this, but it was more so about engaging them in this space that was other. This was actually performed during their opening exhibition event. And there's a DJ, you can kind of see the tiny DJ that's in the corner there. But what ended up happening was that folks were kind of engrossed with this conversation that we were having online. They were getting kind of like an insider view of like what the performer is thinking during the performance. And it was via the text that we were communicating. It was like another layer that's invisible, that someone can see. There was like a visual cue of this like kind of weird catching of time. It's this durational moment as well. So thinking about performance and thinking about how do you capture someone, pull them into the performance, and make them really kind of connect with you in a different way. Because I find like most of the works that were shown were very like performance in its traditional form of just you're watching, there's a video camera there, it's distracting, those types of notions. This was more so of like trying to create this like dialogue via text and having to keep up with the amount of people that were trying to speak to you, and also like access you in a more real way, a more closer way. And in a sense, they were also performing for the work because they were also stationary and then becoming sort of visual cues of like a bunch of people texting at the same time, which is what we see reflected in society all the time. Whenever we go out to a restaurant or whatnot, everyone is always engaged with their phone and mobile devices. This was kind of like the beginning of me using a mobile device as sort of a way of creating heterotopic space and trying to give people cues to perform for a device. And that kind of rolled into my next work, which was X and Waiting. So I think that you heard this briefly before. I created an app for the London Ontario Media Arts Association, and that was in 2023. Over COVID, I was having some challenges because like I have a performative practice majority of the time, and it was difficult. Like, all of my gigs got canceled during COVID, and no one was doing anything live because no one wanted to be beside other people. And so if your practice is all about the body, sometimes it's difficult to go. So I gave myself an assignment basically of starting to just perform for myself, like daily actions of like, how are you existing through COVID? And I created this app in 2023 to capture it as an archive. So this is kind of like the interface of the app. You sign in, it looks like this. There's buttons that you can push, and then it becomes like a meditative moment. So I was trying to copy like what a meditation app looks like. You're performing with the artist, you're waiting with the artist for the duration of the performance, which was 8 minutes. And I would be balancing myself precariously on objects that were propping me up during the COVID period. So it became sort of a sense of pulling audiences in to wait with a phone, and also showcasing like the ridiculousness of some of the meditation apps that we see out there. It was sort of like playing along those lines as well. But I got really great feedback from this. I think people really enjoyed what was happening with this and understood the fact that they're performing with the phone with the artist, because that was kind of the call to action through the app interface. So yeah, that's me.
So, all right, I think we are transitioning to my preamble before the conversation begins. So I just, again, like to thank everyone for being here, and to Cameron and Timmy for putting this together. I'd like to begin with a quote from the end of Danielle LaFrance's article, Notes on Aftermath, published in the Journal of the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present in September 2021, and originally presented in June 2019 as part of the Association of Canadian College and University Teachers of English Conference during a panel called Bad Deleuze, Bad Lacan. And it is my hope to use this to move us forward. Quote, in the aftermath, how do we both stay invigorated by language, by echoes of our own understandings of life and death in texts, while also letting said invigoration die a little bit without leaving us empty, end quote. I'm using this text to bring together our various positionalities, which intersect here and now by way of Pratt's Art and Writing Symposium, and as a framework to guide my thinking and line of inquiry in relation to the practices of artist Dena Yago and David Yu, who I'm excited to be in conversation with today, as we all collectively think through our relationships with writing and praxis at this time. And as a side note, I highly recommend reading Notes on Aftermath, as if in some strange twist of fate that I'm not holding my breath for, I ever teach again, I will make this the first reading with which students come in contact. And I've sent a link to Cameron, and you can download it while you still have institutional access. Now, this smile threat, while you still have, moves us back to the text, which deftly navigates through various moments of potential, veiled as loss, describing that place of limbo between an event, an ending, and what happens next. This amorphous location is probably not too dissimilar to the one some of you are in now, especially students, close to the end, to that sweet hereafter, math. In Notes on Aftermath, LaFrance discusses the transformation of relationships, mostly caused by injurious effects, and though we may associate that with our own current standing in the world, my interest is less specific to the cause, but, as LaFrance states, quote, what it means to continue moving and persisting, end quote, afterwards. Now, what do I mean by my addendum afterwards? Well, this references a specific linearity, embedded, of course, within notions of heterochronology, where ... something happens. I suppose, however, it can't just be any something. I'm specifically referring to an event, which LaFrance denotes as a thing that, quote, ruptures, what once was constant, end quote. Let's step back and look at that again. An event means that something has happened and there is a change, for better or worse. It's also important to note that events are not neutral, but are occurrences that are both effective and affective. We are moved by events and events move us. And though we can't move backwards, and dwelling in the past seems parochial anyway, I want to complicate this idea of an event and the aftermath in a way that totally reorients the classic Beckett phrase, quote, "the end is in the beginning," end quote. To think about art and life as a fucked up version, suggesting the beginning is in the end. We are currently living in and through a number of aftermaths: continued right-wing fascism, racism, capitalism, the global COVID-19 pandemic, the murder of populations made vulnerable, such as individuals from Indigenous, Black, and trans Black women communities, lack of response to the fentanyl crisis, and widespread economic disparities resulting from the continued growth and wealth of select individuals and groups, to name only a few. And let's take a moment just to think about that. LaFrance suggests that the aftermath is, quote, "a way to perceive trauma," end quote, a response brought on by change. But I'd like to think of at least one aspect of the aftermath as a trauma that persists when we don't witness the change we expect to see. In theory, we'd all hope that after a traumatic happening, a change would occur, some social shift that somehow aims to right the wrongs and make sense of the occurrence. You'd hope that in some way, the chronological disruption would disrupt the course that the socio-capitalist machine, better known as our current lived reality, progresses on. However, despite the optimism, we would most definitely be wrong. If nothing else, this aftermath is a cruel joke, firmly buckling us all in as we collectively endure injurious event after injurious event. It keeps chugging on as the social scape of our existence remains unfettered, just mildly perturbed by what it assures us is simply just a bump in the road. Therefore, forged by change and the lack of change, we live in an aftermath that looks pretty much the same as it did before. So the question is, now what? I'm moved to think about the idea of aftermath, not just as a theme, but as a technique that can move us forward. LaFrance states that her conception of an aftermath is an, quote, "effective and cognitive process that holds the residue, the shit, the mess, which precipitated from the event, rife with multiple contradictions and incompatible situations. Offers space to radically change the rules, the scripts for a new situation to emerge," end quote. So what I'm eager to think through with everyone here today is how we can conceive of this aftermath and the traumas associated as a generative spot for destruction and creation. Two processes I want to tether together. And though we have been formed through our individual and collective happenings, we as practitioners have the ability to move from this spot and use the aftermath as a way to think about praxis, because what is art if not an aftermath itself? I'd like to consider the practices of Dena Yago and David Yu from this frame. Their works often progress through approaches that utilize disparate from one another modalities on the spectrum of praxis. Despite these seemingly heterogeneous methodologies, the works intersect along lines of systemic and institutional critique. Through modes of language bending, humor, and intertextuality, both Yago and Yu slyly work in a twofold process that aims to reveal what the power of emptying and reinvigorating forms and spaces looks like through their own unique approaches to writing and art. So today, let's think about what moves these artists in and through praxis, how language functions as a social critique, what narratives we should or need to lay to rest, and how to navigate the world at the end. So to begin, I'd like to think about both of your works as examples of not just writing, but rewriting. And what I mean by this is there's a conscious and productive deployment of language that is tactically responsive. Dena, I'm considering your work Paravents 2021, where you superimpose statements about labor, production, and cultural extractivism over hand-painted images culled from Disney cartoons. And David, I'm thinking about Wer from Dunst, I may not have said that right, effect, Thanks BB, 2018, where the German word relating to the breakdown of the fourth wall in theater is spelled out in gravel on a gallery floor, waiting to be stepped on and kicked, becoming realized and undone by passers-by. So within both of your practices, or these works specifically, what function does reinscription play?
I'll just kick that one off, I guess, because I think I touched on it a little bit in the slides of how the text functions within relation of the image of the object production. Is that oftentimes I start with the text, but it definitely percolates over time and then finishes with me literally re-inscribing it onto the dressing screen or the painting or whatever. So, and also a lot of the texts that I'm using, specifically one of the Paravent works is adjustment, a retake on an Adorno quote, which I think is quite relevant to what you were saying about the aftermath. So there is a lot of citation and kind of paratextual and intertextuality that's happening in these works. And I think that the process of reinscription allows the form to condense and essentialize in a way to where there is not so much excess. And I think that when dealing with poetry, which is the excess of language in a lot of ways, and does kind of have that element to it, it becomes a sort of process of like negotiating what that excess is versus what the meaning is, and how important it is to have language that both allows an openness for reading while is also being quite didactic. So that, I guess, is in those works particularly how reinscription works.
Yeah, for Ver from Dung's effect, thanks BB. So BB was standing for Bertolt Brecht, and he was a playwright and I guess a philosopher in some kinds of ways, creating that term to signal to basically it's about how the audience is always constantly aware of themselves through theater. So he would do things like signal to them during the actual like theater play or whatnot. So with this work, I was really kind of signaling towards the viewer is the ones that are on display and they should feel uncomfortable in the space. So the gravel was very precariously kind of pulled placed so that it spelled out the whole word through the whole gallery space. The Orleans Gallery in Ottawa that I did this in was just like massive, absolutely massive. And I spent hours kind of just placing gravel and like tight lines to spell this out through with a projector. When people first entered the space, they didn't expect it to be, I probably thought it was vinyl or something. And as they walked over the ground, it would just like scatter all of this gravel everywhere. They can feel it underneath their shoes. They're always thinking of themselves. They're always locating themselves with that word. So with that word, it was kind of making it become alive in some ways. And it was, you know, kind of using that text as a signal to engage the audience in a very specific, uncomfortable way. They're ruining the artwork. They feel bad about it sometimes. And then other times they didn't, because, you know, audience will do whatever audience wants to do. And that's kind of the fun thing about the works that I pull forward sometimes. So they were using the gravel to draw and spell their own things. And that was kind of fascinating as well. And I never expected that to happen. I just thought that they were just going to ruin it. But yeah, in terms of like using this text in a very specific way, that is one of the ways that I was trying to expand that word so that it also encompasses a audience and an audience perspective.
Timmy, I think you had a follow-up you want to?
Yeah, I mean, maybe if it's okay if this organically grows in this way. I think in response to both of you, I'm curious. I first was thinking about this in terms of Dena, but I think it really applies to both of you. Within this, when I hear the word rewriting, and also within the context of thinking about the merging, what happens when you merge these two senses of time of encountering an art object and encountering text, or encountering, like Dena was saying, text in like the circulation of images and text within memes on the internet. I'm curious how both of you think about citation, and like because when we, one way that we encounter writing and language as we grow up and go through school, there's such a boundedness and such a kind of inescapable responsibility of thinking about citation. And then with art, there's obviously other ways of thinking about citation as well. And of course, memes have a different way of thinking about the recirculation and alteration of language. And so I think in both, like, the rewriting or repurposing language, obviously this thing that nobody really fully owns but comes in and out of our mouths. I'm curious how you both sort of respond to that or think about that as a part of your work, because there's, it's maybe just one last thing into that, like with Dena, I feel like the way that you're talking about the encounter of writing, oopsie, we lost one of our camera. The way that we encounter writing in some of your work is kind of the sounding of it. Like, and I think with certain memes also, it sounds like this kind of text. And David, also, you said, like, I wanted the feel of a meditation app, which is also saying, like, it sounds like a meditation app. And I think that's a very particular way of thinking about citation. It's kind of my sort of prompt too. Anyway.
All right, I'll take a bet at that one. I think that in terms of citation and sourcing and attribution, I think that there are different registers of information that exist within a work that are legible to different audiences. And I think that one way of speaking might feel more accessible to an art audience versus another, like a K-hole report being legible to like a pop capitalist audience, I guess, or like those fluent in branding and marketing and things like that. So I think that I fully agree. There are ways of writing which are receivable by different audiences in different ways, and certain modes of text. Like if I'm doing a riff on an Adorno quote, I think I try to inflect that with a slightly more approachable language, but still, I'm posturing in that way. So I think that's definitely a part. It's a question of sort of like what mode of speech I'm speaking in. And in that Billy Bass play, each Billy Bass was kind of performing a different, in a broad sense, generational position, and the affect with which they were speaking was very identifiable and kind of caricatured as such. There was like, the boomer male, there was I can share a link rather than kind of talking through each one. But yes, I fully agree that the affect and mode of thought, it's really specifically thinking about the receiving audience of those for me.
For me, it's more about context and how people sort of approach and understand the work. A lot of times I try to blur that boundary of what is real and not real. Is this really like a stage setting for themselves? I try to encapsulate them in that kind of way. So context is kind of what really drives my citations, especially with referendums effect, which is a very hard word to say. Yeah, So that one in particular was about trying to like create that word and make it alive. Yeah.
I'm wondering, even just to follow up from that, if there's like a level of, like killing your idols in this, or like, the death of the father, where the reappropriation, the taking on of this citationality, these quotings, has a way of undoing or breaking those previous highly revered individuals within art, within theory. Would Bertolt Brecht love to be referred to as BB? And how does that kind of disturb him and his lineage in a way that's productive for us to think about, again, the end of text being a new rebirth of text and thinking?
Yeah, I think that he would love to be referred to as BB. Personally, I think about him a lot, just because of this breaking of the fourth wall, as you said before, and then also of everything that I do is almost like I'm engaging with theater in some sort of expanded field. But I think that, like, thinking back about citations and, like, the in context, when we're pulling quotes and putting them in essays or in the writing that we do, you're always trying to reframe them in a way that you're proving your own point. You're pulling that context forward, right? So you're manipulating the text in a way that is thoughtful or maybe not thoughtful. You're giving it a new kind of perspective with the other words you're putting around it, right? So within thinking about that, like, art also works within that way of like reframing of imagery, reframing of how you deal with a space. That's always the most exciting things for me whenever I engage with new space, is like, how are you going to shift this space into something that's like near and dear to me, and like trying to get my voice out. I don't know if that's the same for you, Dena.
Yep. Tracks.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me personally, I'm always trying to insult someone, so it moves in a different way. But I think that all these things and ways of engaging and reclaiming, I think, is another important way to think about text, or like valid, contemporary, important like tenets of praxis. So maybe do we want to, like, I could jump in down a bit in my questioning, but maybe we could move into language in the social sphere and um, think about both TikToks and TikTok and memes. So I'm wondering, where should I go here? Where's my main question? Oops, I guess I'll move to my TikTok. So I guess in the conversation I've had with a previous fellow artist, or previously with a fellow artist, about video art and TikTok, and the challenges this app has brought up with both the creation and presentation of video, I'm wondering if you think that the memification of language that has also transitioned into critique has unsettled writing practices and artistic practices, or has it opened up new potentials and engagement?
I mean, I feel strongly that it's opened up new potentials and engagement. First off, I think that the straightforwardness and kind of simplicity of meme forms makes a lot of complex thought more accessible to people, for better or for worse. In some cases, you just see the speed with which ideology gets disseminated and adopted online. I think memes have a huge amount to do with that, to state what I think we all feel is the obvious. I would also say that I just remember writing a trend report that wasn't a K-hole thing, but was like a commissioned work. And one of the trends was about how like visual language, how we were becoming accustomed to a new dominant form of communication because the emoji keyboard was naturalized into iOS. And I think that it was like the word of the year was an emoji, I think, and this was a decade ago. So thinking about how new these forms are is something that we shouldn't take for granted. Like these things are evolving every day. And then I think the last thing that I'll say is that, you know, I don't spend the most time on TikTok, but I do consume way too many memes, and they're very fundamental to my practice because it's just the form of communication, but also because they are these kind of primary cultural signifiers that have like infinitely flexible semiotic tensile strengths. Like it can become this thing that stretches and can be reinscribed. And there's an optimistic form of that. There's like a hopeful ends, which is that you can reimbue these narratives with, you know, queer alternate minor histories or minor narratives. The other one is that you can have what happens with Pepe the Frog, things getting co-opted and sucked up by fascists. So there's two sides to that coin, but I personally enjoy utilizing the former.
Yeah, same with me. I think that you seeing it evolve into a language in itself is so fascinating, of just being able to, like, you know, you see a meme and then you immediately know what someone's trying to like say to you. You just send a meme to someone if you're frustrated and you're like, oh gosh, you know, the burning dog meme of being like, this is fine. Like everyone can fully understand. Like that could be like 4 sentences basically of being like, I'm having a horrible day today and I'm trying to like get through it, but I'm also being oppressed by work, you know. So it's speaking more volumes. And I know that's such a cliche to say like a photo is 1,000 words or whatever that quote is, but yeah, it's fascinating to see this the memification evolve into how we're communicating with each other now, and I think about that quite often. I also think about like, to go back to your question of like unsettling writing practices, I don't think it has actually. I think that it is what it is on its own, and writing practices are something else as well.
Maybe to Christine, could you respond also by voicing a perspective of seeing how it is unsettled, or how you see the other side of that?
How memes function as unsettling?
No, if you know, because I feel like part of the question was, has it unsettled writing practices, as in like maybe close them down or open them up? And I'm curious about like, what is our romanticization of language being unsettled by these new kinds of writing practices?
Well, I mean, I'll move back to where I was thinking about TikTok and video, because I think primarily, like, I functioned as a video artist that employed writing. And I, in my initial conversation with a fellow artist, was also a video artist. And we both kind of come to the thought of like, is TikTok like the end of video art, in that like there's so much proliferation, there's so many good things out there that have also kind of co-opted ways that video art functions, that it deflates you know, the positionality, the potentiality of what you can do. And it's an exciting thing where those creative processes have been shifted towards anyone, but it does potentially create challenges with artistic practice, in that where do you go in your own work if you know, user 947 is making better shit than you ever could? And how then do you situate yourself, move forward, think about practicing at the, maybe at the end of an art form, and how then can we work towards establishing new modes of communication, artistic, you know, projects, in light of this, in relation to this, against this. You know, I think that I'm never calling for a return to a formal, but I do also see those kinds of trends emerging, that you know, even there's an uptick in like analog film, which is totally oppositional to the idea of TikTok, and maybe that's where that shift is coming from. But in terms of writing, yeah, it's interesting. I had another writer friend who said she moved all her work to short form Instagram posts because that's how people were consuming her work, and that's how she was able to connect. And that does kind of deflate the idea of this kind of classic A art. Um, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. I'm not judging in any way, but there is a difference.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I could just kind of follow up on that, I think sometimes about how there are such rigidly categorized structural forms. You know, within poetry, you have a sonnet, you have a haiku. All of these things are rubrics within which you can kind of negotiate what the limits are and how much you want to do the dance versus how much you want to resist it or subvert it. And I think that similarly, like there are similar opportunities within dominant forms and emerging forms of writing and media. I think a lot about how I feel like video essays are really having a moment in terms of how language is being digested and disseminated. And I think that, you know, I look at core videos on TikTok and I'm like, this is better than anything I could possibly imagine making, but maybe it's enough for a practice to be in conversation with these forms versus needing to emulate them or feeling the pressure to emulate them.
That's wonderful. I think that's like such a helpful way of pulling this in. Combining what you both have just said, Christine and Dena. Christine, you brought up the word positionality, and I sort of had in the back of my head when you said that like, you know, essentially what you're saying is like the perhaps the one thing that's being lost in a turn to, let's stay with language and stay with memes, for example, is positionality. I'm very curious for maybe David and Dena, since you've thought about the language of memes quite a bit, or rewritten with the language of apps, as David, you did. Is there a particular grammar? Like you said, there's like a sonnet, you know, has a certain form, has a certain rhythm, a cadence, a structure of some kind. I'm curious for I mean, I have my own version of what I imagine, but there is to me, a different kind of positionality that takes place within a meme and the voice of a meme, and what that grammar is.
For me, I was actually trying to resist that. So for me, like a meme or something along those lines is something quick and digestible, feeds you the information as quick as possible for you to like to be the most impactful. For my app, I was actually resisting that by slowing people down, by having them wait with me in a way that actually is resisting towards that, the way that you would operate with a phone. I think there was some statistic out there that people have only like 5 seconds of attention span before they click onto something else. If it's even 5 seconds, it could be 1 second or 3 seconds now. With the app, it was designed to be as boring as possible and to really kind of engage someone in that boredom and stillness. So when I was pulling it together, it was more so about trying to get folks to engage with it so that they are also still and as still as I'm trying to be. So in that way, I was pushing back against the speed at which this information and language is propelling forward.
I think that I a lot in terms of the memes that we're talking about, I think it is very important to recognize that a lot of meme language is co-opted from Black English vernaculars. And that's something that needs to be very critically made aware of. Where do certain memes come from? A lot of it is being recuperated from Black spaces on the internet. Then there is also something that feels like internet culture that is not necessarily pulling from that, but it is also language that seems to go through many layers of translation because the internet is a global space. You have memes like Wojak, or I don't know, we can brainstorm other ones that come from Polish 4chan, or just East Asian languages that are going through multiple layers of translation with and through English. So when we think about English as being like the dominant language of the internet, there is the intertext and subtext that it has gone through many layers of translation to get there.
Well, I think it brings us to a different question I had, which maybe we've kind of navigated around, but I think I'll still come back to it anyways. That there is a difference in the type of language or the mode of language you both use, and so Dena, I'm thinking about how your work employs a language that could be associated with the colloquially coined term, art speak. It moves into the theoretical, quote unquote, highbrow, intellectual aphorisms that are all kind of declarative statements. And I'm thinking about Industry City from 2022 as an example of this. And then, David, your work is on the opposite end of language, employing a living form of communication that is reflected of common speech. The mode of writing, which I should say includes also conversations with and through audiences, exists on a level of an utterance. And I'm thinking about Are We Having Fun Yet from 2016. So the modes of communication move differently across your works. And so I'm wondering if you could speak about voice and tone and that role. And also for you both, do you think your writing in the work is propositional or directive, and for what purpose?
You want to go? So Are We Having Fun Yet was a work that was done for a Katzman Gallery. It was also during a performance festival. It was 4 teenagers that was employed to be in the space and take up bratty teenage space. And folks, like people that are not typically within gallery spaces, I know that's a little bit stereotypical in some sorts of ways, but they were quite young and very abrasive. So there was sculptures of phone numbers that were around them, and folks can again use the same tactic that I used for the other work, But Thirst Is Real, text them. They would only speak to them via text, and they had a script that was prepared to assault the audience as much as possible in their teenage voice. The script was loose, and they can, text back whatever they wanted to, as long as they kind of follow the script pattern. And it always ended with "Are we having fun yet?" Because that was the only thing that was in the gallery space, was the reaction towards them. So what was your other question? Yeah, so my tone, I guess, would be like I try to adopt the tone of what the actors, performers would have said, but also give them a thorough line of kind of art didactic speak, because they kind of functioned as the labels, and they were trying to describe themselves, but unable to do so because of the fact that they were also like embedding, memes and photographs and whatnot around them. I think that it was a work that was trying to disrupt the gallery space as much as possible, and also challenge viewers to think about what the work really was. Was it the experience, or was it the actual, like, the performance of these folks doing this weird vignette that's standing in a very kind of comical fashion.
I guess to answer that question, it's interesting that you read it as being international art English, because a lot of the tone that I'm taking is more kind of advertising copy, like corporate branding language, less so, I think, than art language. So for instance, that Cursed Virtues piece, which is what you're referring to, is really specifically thinking about terms that get touted by sort of, cultural capital, I guess, flexibility, mobility, things like that, less so than things that you'd read in a press release per se. But I do think that when I'm thinking about the tone, there's a level of kind of satirization that's happening. There's a level of humor, and I also I made a piece a few years ago, and then had a friend come over to the studio and was like, "This kind of feels like a book report. Like it's really didactic and really closed." And I realized that something that in terms of the tone that I'm trying to get to with the language that I use is that there should be a level of openness and kind of productive ambiguity or engaging ambiguity that begs a question or feels a little bit like a Zen koan or something, where it's language that's meant to be kind of roiled over in your mind and reach a level of semantic satiation almost, where these things sort of like the wheel spins as you're reading it and thinking about it. So yeah, I guess in terms of tone, there's this question of closed versus open, didactic versus engaging, and think about those things a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both of them employ these different approaches, but work towards these institutional critiques. And I think that humor is the spot where we should connect that now. And so I guess I'm wondering, how do you approach humor during this time? Like, how do you approach humor or irony in this time of aftermath? What's its role? What's its use? What's its place? And does our current time change how you develop or utilize humor? Because I think that that's an important thing to think about. During this time of multiple traumas existing, how do we situate? Humor?
Well, I'd say that irony is a pretty robust topic to go down, so I'll just address that one head on. I think that the concept of binary is inscribed with a binary of something meaning something rhetorically opposite, and that is not what's going on in my work. And I wouldn't, I think that there are different forms of humor that can reach different ends, and even the binary of like irony and cringe or something like that is not really what I'm getting at through the work. I do think that humor is a historically and humanistically disarming mechanism. It kind of brings people to the table, as long as it's not at somebody's expense, but it is something that brings people in and opens people up in a way. And that's where my approach to it is. And it allows you to speak about some of the darker, cynical aspects of our existence in a way that might be received versus other forms. So that's, I guess, my take on it.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. I use it as a disarming tool. Because most people going into a space that is unsure. Some folks find they don't know how to act within an exhibition space. They don't know how to engage. And I use this as a tool to engage folks. It gives the laugh. It gives someone access to be able to relax a little bit more, to walk with the work or immerse themselves more fully. Oftentimes I kind of use it as sort of a shock mechanism to have someone really react to something, and I find that you can really access someone through it more fully than a passive observer.
Well, I also think it moves into your focus on relationality, David, because I think humor is essentially relational. It does build a conversation between the disparities of writing and reading. It brings the viewer into these spaces that elicits their response. And I think that's a nice thing. Sorry.
Yeah. Also, humor is inclusive, right? Everyone can laugh.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess I'm wondering. Oh, maybe I should ask Timmy and Cameron, where are we in terms of timing? Should we keep going a little bit, or should we open up to the audience? What do you think?
I think either is fine. Opening to the audience is great, and if the audience doesn't have questions, maybe your final question would be a great one to kind of sum up with.
Okay. So maybe I'll let people percolate their own questions, and I'll just move to my own end. As we near the finishing point of this event, I'm interested in thinking about the idea of end or the end, both in relation to your projects, thematically or strategically, but also within the greater context of your work as practitioners. So Dena, within your work, I see reflections imagined out of late stage capitalism, such as the Bucket 2021. And then also the end plays an important role within the history of performance art. And David, your works often directly respond to these chronological parameters, like in The Thirst is Real from 2019. So firstly, I was wondering if you could talk about the idea of the or an end within your work, such as its meanings, associations, finitude, potentiality. But then I think within this context and more generally, what happens when you get to the end of a project? Specifically, how do you determine an end, and how does it incite you to go forward?
Okay. I would say that in most of my projects, they are quite ongoing. I'd say like the larger question of how text and image relate, or how to kind of communicate and engage with a sort of embodied somatic cultural experience is like one of the bigger themes in my work, and that I'm just exploring with the media that I'm working through at a given moment. With the collaborative projects, the end might have a very different and foreseen or unforeseen temporal moment. With something like K-Hole or with Applied Arts, or I was working on Arena, those had very open time spans and had come to their own organic ends as well. So I haven't really ever done something specifically durational, but David, it seems like you might have a different relationship to it.
Yeah, sometimes there is no end to the things that I do, but specifically in Thirst is Real, it was the ending of the actual event that I was performing it in, and that was the end of it. I'm planning on doing that work again, but for an 8-hour or a 10-hour time span of just being within a festival setting or like a Biennale setting. But I guess that question kind of more relates to the app that we just did in 2023, where it started with COVID. It started with like trying to sort of cope during COVID, and then the app is supposed to end when the waiting is over, but we're still kind of in a holding pattern. So potentially this can go on forever, but what I've told the audience is through the app is that this app will self-destruct when the waiting is over. So I'm just trying to find a perfect time for it to self-destruct. And I'm thinking, just between us all here, that is 2024, because I think that I've kind of gone all the way with it so far. Don't know if there's any more household items that I can balance on. If you take a look at the app. So maybe I'm just running out of situations where I can do the work anymore. But like looping back, I think that I think about sort of like the timing of the work quite a lot because of all the durational elements that I pulled into it, especially with like people waiting in space. The work for Nicolas Robert Gallery, which is an actor that acted, like I hired an actor as a doppelganger for myself, and he was in the gallery space. He was an Asian actor, and he wore my clothes, and people just sort of assumed that he was me, and just he was my stand-in, he was my voice, and he took my actual phone so that when people were engaging with me, they, I still get texts from people now of that engaged with that performance and thought that he was the artist. That work lasted until the phone battery died. So when the phone died, the performance was over, and then he could walk away from the space. So yeah, it's about this like finality of a thing, and I think that some of it has to do with sort of like theater, thinking about theater and thinking about like how do you finish a play? How do you finish? What was that finishing moment? So yeah, I always kind of make a mark to so that we're not just waiting for the rest of our lives.
Well, it's even interesting to think about in relation to, this being part of a program where students are coming to the end of their work and the end of, the possibility of working with institutional benefit, but also within the institutional framework and those kinds of challenges. So I guess another moving off point from that is, how did you move from the position of student to working as an artist outside of the institution? Obviously, again, David, for you, in relationship and that's the institution, but how did those transitions and those endings and new beginnings work to progress your practice?
Sure. Oh, David, if you want to go. Well, I think that I've ended up in a position where I have some marketable skill that can cover the production of my art because of this weird experience of having a collective art project that kind of charade as trend forecasting until it became very real. So that has always been my personal model, is just, using one hand to feed the other. And for many, I've never really made a living off of my art. So that is not how that works. And also in the States, grants and residencies are a bit hard to come by, especially for, the type of work that I make. I don't find it particularly legible to a grant receiving audience. And I think that that's a lot of what I end up doing with applied arts. Is I jokingly call it like the school for wayward artists, which is kind of realizing that the reason why I have these, jobs that I've ended up in post-college was because I was trusting that being an artist is a position of kind of presence and understanding. And it turns out that the one way that you can kind of take that and employ yourself with it is through strategy and insights and forecasting. And I feel like any artist can do that strongly, especially if you're young and a student and coming out of college. Though it's a pretty demoralizing industry to work in, so don't recommend it from that scale. But I think that the precarious reality of being an artist or any form of cultural producer is that it's not something that very few can make a living off of. And I think that the sort of professionalization of other aspects of your being are unfortunately, what you've got to flex. But maybe I should just shift that from saying you to me, because that's just been my experience with it.
Yeah, I think that same. I never really made a living off of my art. I do rely heavily on grants and commissions, but I also have a full-time job as well, and I use that as kind of the funding for my practice a lot of the time. I think thinking about it, it is difficult, but it's worth it in the end for me. I use my writing as the tool to steer myself and to really get those grants, basically, because I'm giving a framework for myself in order to work out of. And it was helpful in that way to be able to talk about the work and to give someone like a full snapshot of like what I was doing. So it became kind of like something I leaned on in order to do all the other things, to line it up so I can do the actual work itself. But yeah, it is a process like that.
I think the one thing that I would add was that right out of school, between like 21 and 26, I was working on the website Arena with a group of friends, and I was working on K-Hole with a group of friends. And as messy and complicated as it can be to sort of like hitch your life making and aspirations and ambitions and joys and sadness and all of that to a group of other people, it also was like very unalienating to a very alienating situation. So I think that the sort of like banding together, of which there, you know, some of the projects that I see out in the world that I find most interesting, like, you know, I know Timmy from Montez Press Radio World, the sort of community-based work that happens in a collective sphere can, if not financially help you figure out your practice, at least emotionally and psychologically make you feel a little less alone.
Same here. Right out of art school, I was writing for Art Slant magazine, doing reviews of shows in London and UK. And then shortly afterwards, I got a project management job with Freeze somehow. I have no idea how that happened, but it kind of like set me on the path of just project management from then on. And so I did a lot of like piece work to be able to kind of give myself the flexibility so that I can actually have a practice as well. Like that was kind of a key moment of knowing that I can shift my time so that I can give blocks of time to go to a residency and clear off space to do that, you know.
Yeah, I think working within communities with collaboration and connecting, you know, like we are here today, I think is a really essential part of keeping this type of work going. You know, working in silos is challenging at the best of times, and sometimes also obviously detrimental to practices. So it's important to have these conversations and be engaged and continue that engagement, you know, outside of the school institution and all that other stuff. So I really appreciate you all you know, sharing today and connecting and showing your work. I think that that's great, and I'm excited by the new connections that that have come here today, and to come back to old ones that have been percolating for a while. I don't know if there's any more questions in the chat. Does anyone else have any ruminations, thoughts, queries for all of us? Either of the hosts, to me. Sorry, I didn't want to push that on you. I hate when people do that.
I have lots to say, but I'll be quiet.
Yeah, I think maybe we can wrap the formal conversation and let informal conversations continue. So we will make this recording available internally at Pratt to the students who weren't able to join today because of scheduling conflicts, particularly. But also I encourage everyone to review the chat for links to the artworks discussed and the projects discussed, as well as the reading that Christine cited at the beginning of their intro, which is available as a full text from Pratt Library. So thank you to them as always. Thank you also to, again, to Pratt Humanities and Media Studies, Writing Across the Curriculum, and School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Gina and Joshua. Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Timmy, for all of your work on this and everything that you brought to it. And thank you most of all to our guests, Dena, Yago, David, Yu, and Christine Negus. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure that our students will benefit from this conversation at this time, both the historical time, but also this particular moment in their academic career. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you all.